If you had to pick just one word to sum up the history of California, it would have to be transformation. Seriously, this is the story of a place that's been completely and radically remade time and time again. So, how did a land of incredible natural diversity become the global powerhouse it is today? Well, let's dive in. To get our heads around this huge story, we're going to break it down into 5 big chapters. First, we'll look at the first Californians. Then, we'll see it as a distant edge of the Spanish Empire. After that, the explosion of the gold rush. Then, we'll see how a modern state was literally engineered out of that chaos. And finally, we'll explore how the whole idea of the California dream was born. I want to start with just one number. 300,000. That's the estimated population of Native Americans in California before any Europeans showed up. Now, that might just sound like a big number, but get this. That was 1/3 of all Native people living in the area we now call the United States. This was not an empty land, not even close. It was a thriving, populated world. So our first chapter starts way before any explorers or gold miners. It starts with the people who called this place home for thousands of years and who learned to shape it into a land of incredible abundance. Okay, so we've got to go way back, like to the end of the last ice age. People migrated out of Asia, across the Bering Land Bridge, and made their way down the coast. And we know this isn't just a theory. We have hard proof, like the remains of the Arlington Springs Man, found on the Channel Islands off the coast, which date back about 13,000 years. That's some seriously deep history.
And what's really wild is that this wasn't some single, unified culture. No way. Think of it more like a complex, vibrant mosaic of peoples. You had dozens of distinct tribes speaking somewhere between 80 and 90 different languages and dialects. It was one of the most culturally and linguistically diverse places in all of North America.
And don't for a second think these were simple societies. Not at all. These were complex cultures that had ingeniously adapted to all of California's different climates. They figured out how to turn acorns into a reliable, storable food source. They actively managed the environment using controlled burns to promote healthy growth. They developed amazing tools, from tiny, intricate fish hooks made of shell to massive plank canoes that could travel the open ocean, connecting vast trade networks. But that world was about to be turned upside down. For over 200 years, European ships just kind of sailed on by. To them, California was, well, it was just the distant, forgotten edge of the Spanish Empire. You had these early explorers, right? Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo shows up in 1542, plants a flag for Spain. Then, a few decades later, the famous English privateer, Sir Francis Drake, swings by and calls it New Albion. But here's the thing. For centuries, that's all it was. Just names on a map. There were no settlements, no real presence to speak of. So, what was the tipping point? What finally made Spain get serious about this place? Well, it wasn't gold or some hidden treasure. It was plain old fear. They saw Russian fur traders creeping down from Alaska and knew the British were always looking to expand. So, colonizing California was really a defensive move, a geopolitical play to protect the northern flank of their empire in the Americas. And Spain's main tool for this was the mission system. Now, on paper, the goal sounded, well, twofold: bring Christianity to the native people and lock down the territory for Spain. But the reality for native Californians was an absolute nightmare. The missions became centers for deadly European diseases. The whole system was built on the forced labor of native people, and it violently stamped out their traditional cultures and way of life. So, beyond the mission walls, what did California look like? Pretty much just huge, sprawling cattle ranches called ranchos. The entire economy was isolated and kind of sleepy, built on trading cowhides and tallow, which is basically fat for making candles and soap. It was a remote world, completely unprepared for the meteor that was about to hit. And that brings us to the single event that didn't just change California, it set it on fire. We're talking, of course, about the gold rush. This wasn't just an event, it was a conflagration that remade the world in the blink of an eye. The timing of this is just, it's so crazy you couldn't make it up. On January 24th, 1848, a guy named James Marshall sees something shining in a river. Gold. And then, get this, just 9 days later, a treaty is signed that officially ends the Mexican-American War and hands California over to the United States. The U.S. had just stumbled into owning one of the richest places on Earth, and they didn't even know it yet. The result was, well, it was an explosion. In 1840, you had maybe 8,000 non-native people in the whole area. Fast forward just 10 years after the news of gold gets out, and that number skyrockets to over 120,000. And these people weren't just from back east. They came from literally every corner of the globe, all chasing the same dream. This flood of people was so huge, so fast, that California just blew right past the whole becoming a territory phase. You know, the normal process? Nope. Instead, there's this big political deal called the Compromise of 1850, which, to settle the issue of slavery, fast-tracked California into the U.S. as a free state. And just like that, the balance of power in the country was changed forever. But we have to talk about the dark, brutal side of this story. Because for the native peoples, this gold rush was an absolute catastrophe. The massive wave of settlers and miners led to what is now recognized as the California Genocide. Native communities were driven off their ancestral lands, and shocking violence, often encouraged and even paid for by the state, led to the murder of thousands upon thousands. So that really begs the question, right? You've got this society born from chaos, from greed, from incredible violence. How on earth do you build a stable, modern state on top of that? Well, the answer brings us to our next chapter. It's a story of brute force, not with guns this time, but with engineering and industrial power on a scale that's hard to even imagine. It was time to tame the land itself. First things first, they had to break California out of its isolation, and that job fell to four incredibly wealthy and frankly ruthless tycoons known as the Big Four. They financed the Central Pacific Railroad, blasting through the solid granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains, and in 1869, they did it. They've connected California to the rest of the country. A trip that once took 6 months by sea could now be done in 6 days. You see, that railroad was like the master key that unlocked everything else. Suddenly, you could ship California's crops all over the country, turning the Central Valley into America's breadbasket. Then, boom, they strike oil down in Southern California, which fueled the rise of the automobile. But the one resource that underpinned all of this growth was water. If you really want to grasp how ambitious this was, just think about this one number, 1,926 feet. That's how high the California State Water Project has to pump water up and over the Tehachapi Mountains just to get it from northern to southern California. It's the highest water lift in the world, a mind-boggling feat of engineering that keeps modern California alive. And all of this incredible foundation of railroads and oil and engineered water, it gave birth to something totally different, something intangible. It gave birth to an idea, a cultural myth that we all know, the California Dream. So in the 20th century, you see these iconic industries just explode onto the scene, each one building on what came before. You've got Hollywood, which basically becomes the world's dream factory, beaming images of glamour and sunshine to every corner of the planet. Then, during the World Wars and the Cold War, the aerospace industry takes over. And then, of course, the big one. A little place called Silicon Valley becomes the undisputed center of the tech universe. So when you look back, from the deep past of its first peoples, to the Spanish frontier, to the absolute chaos of the gold rush, and these massive engineering projects, California's one constant has been radical, relentless change. Which really leaves us with one big question. In a state that's all about reinventing itself, what could the next transformation possibly look like? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into California's epic story. If you enjoyed this, you should definitely check out our whole U.S. State Histories playlist. And hey, for more summaries like this, make sure you subscribe to the Notebook Summaries channel. Thanks for watching.